Reading of The Life of Samuel Johnson by James Boswell. So tonight we still haven't gotten to the book proper. We're going to do a note on the text. Let's continue. The two sets of Piozzi marginalia, which are the special feature of this edition of James Boswell's Life of Samuel Johnson, LL.D., are from the 1816 edition of The Life, the eighth, now at the Houghton Library at Harvard University, and from an 1807 edition, the fifth, now the property of Donald and Mary Hyde of North Branch, New Jersey. Remember, Mrs. Piozzi was the Mrs. Thrall of Boswell's time. She's the woman that had the notes, that kept the notes about her reading of the book. So we get her commentary because she knew Johnson and Boswell both. The history of the former has been recorded by Percival Merritt in Harvard Library Notes for April 1926. Mrs. Piozzi bought it in November 1816 from Upham, a Bath bookseller. In September 1823, it was sold at the Emporium in Manchester by a Mr. Broster of Chester, who probably obtained it from Mrs. Piozzi's adopted son, Sir John Salisbury Piozzi Salisbury. That's the name. It was at this time probably bought by one J. Webster, who penciled a few comments and a few crosses into it and jotted down some page references. Webster's books were sold at Mr. Evans's in April 1826. The Life apparently came into the possession of the Reverend Henry Wellesley of New Inn Hall, Oxford, who lent it to Hayward when he was working on his Life of Mrs. Piozzi. Wellesley's library was sold in November 1866. The Life seems to have been purchased by Sir William Augustus Fraser, whose bookplate is... You okay? The dog fell off the ottoman. You okay? Yeah, okay. That's kind of surprising, huh? He fell off the ottoman onto the other dog, and they're both staring at me now like that's my fault. Sorry, guys. So this is rather convoluted. So we're getting the history of the books that Mrs. Piozzi had, the long, what do you call it? The is that the word providence? There's a word with a P that explains, how it came to be. Let's see. Where was I? The Life apparently came into the possession of the Reverend Henry Wellesley of New Inn Hall, Oxford, who lent it to Hayward when he was working on his Life of Mrs. Piozzi. Wellesley's library was sold in November 1866. The Life seems to have been purchased by Sir William Augustus Fraser, whose bookplate is now in each of the 4 volumes. When Fraser's library was sold at Sotheby's in April 1901, Quaritch bought the Life. Miss Amy Lowell probably secured it from Quaritch. She bequeathed it to Harvard in 1925, where it is now part of the Amy Lowell collection of books and manuscripts. Mrs. Lowell used to read from the marginalia to her friends, in a manner suggestive of the charm of Madame Piozzi herself. So imagine her reading it. She would have the book and read from it and try to kind of take on the airs and the character of Madame Piozzi herself. Excuse me. A. Edward Newton, excuse me, heard her do so, and misunderstanding the edition annotated, wrote in the Amenities of Book Collecting, 1918, "Who does not envy her the possession of the first edition of Boswell's Life of Johnson, filled with the marginalia of the one person in the world whose knowledge of the old man rivaled that of the great biographer himself? It is clear from a passage in Thralania, I know I'm butchering some of these names, that Mrs. Piozzi read a copy of the first edition, but whether she annotated it and where the copy now is are unknown. The Harvard copy has nearly 575 marginalia. I think marginalia are like scribbles on the side. In addition to these, it contains about 1,000 marks of one sort or another. Hayward printed in the first edition of his work on Mrs. Piozzi, 1861, about 25 of these marginalia. And in the second edition, 1861, about 50 more. G.B. Hill knew Hayward's book and used a few of the marginalia in his edition of The Life, 1887. In Dr. Johnson's Mrs. Thrall, J.H. Laubin in 1910 reprinted about 55 of them. A.E. Newton printed part of one, which he presumably remembered Amy Lau reading in the June 1918 Atlantic Monthly, and in the Amenities of Book Collecting, Merritt, in the April 1926 Harvard Library Notes, quoted about 20, only a few of which had not previously appeared in Hayward. L.F. Powell had a typescript of them which he used in his revision of Hill, 1934, but he quotes or refers to only about 75. The Hyde set of The Life is probably the annotated copy which was in the possession of Bond, the publisher, about 1860. It was for long in the library. I know this is rough to get through, but it's important we kind of get through this before we get into the proper part. We kind of learn the history of the notebooks that were used. It was owned for a time by Mina Steele Smith. In 1925, it was in the hands of the English bookseller Charles Sawyer, who sold it to Colonel Ralph Isham. The Hydes acquired it at the auction of Isham's library after his death. This 1807 edition of The Life has about 450 marginalia and contains about 100 marginal marks, underscorings, etc. The 1807 and 1816 sets contain about 60 identical or almost identical marginalia, perhaps copied one from the other, and about 85 passages which have more or less similar marginalia in the two editions. All the marginalia are written in ink, but not, as the varying character of the handwriting shows, at the same time. Interesting, so they have the using the handwriting to indicate that it was different people who were making those notes. The occasional dates, in fact, prove this. The marginal marks, so not all of them are dated. The marginal marks is like putting together. It's like a detective novel, putting the pieces together. The marginal marks, etc., are also in ink, except that in the Harvard set, many were made with a red or a violet crayon. Who would use a crayon? Probably not a crayon in the sense that we think of it, like Crayolas. Probably more like in terms of the French artists, use of a crayon. Miss Smith printed about 50 of the Isham marginalia in the London Mercury for January 1922. A short article about the Isham copy in the London Times for December 30th, 1925, quoted almost entire in the New York Evening Post Literary Review, January 23rd, 1926, quoted 6 of them. The text used in this edition is that of the 8th edition, 1816, printed by C. Baldwin for Cadell and Davies, the text of the Harvard annotated set. It has been exactly followed, except for a few changes in punctuation and capitalization, and the correction of a few printer slips. That's exactly what I'm doing in my transcription of Solitude. I'm adjusting for punctuation, capitalization, and a few printer slips, and spelling. Using more modern spelling when I can. The devices used in printing the marginalia are, I trust, clear. Every comment and every indication of a mark is followed by an H or an I, sometimes both, to indicate which of the two annotated sets it is from. H for Harvard and H for Harvard and H for Hyde. Obviously would not do. So it is necessary to revert to I for Isham. I'm not going to follow that once I get started. I'm going to forget that. To indicate the position of the 1807 or 1816 text of each marginal line, we have quoted the two first and the two last words beginning and ending the line or lines against which it is placed. It is not always perfectly clear just what word or phrase Mrs. Piozzi intended a question mark or an exclamation mark to refer to. Interesting. We have sometimes had to choose between two possibilities. A small reference letter in the text indicates a marginal note. The exact reference of some of the marginalia is also not wholly clear. The spelling, punctuation, and capitalization of the marginalia are Mrs. Piozzi's, though occasionally we may have printed a small letter where Mrs. Piozzi intended a capital, a dash wherein she intended dots, or vice versa. Sometimes a period where she used a colon. All her dashes have been reduced to a common length, and all her strings or dots to 3. Dots in the marginalia never indicate omission. Interesting. So Mrs. Piozzi had maybe an inconsistent method of marking things up, and they tried to clean that up and standardize it in some way. It's interesting how things that would have been just common, casual notes on her part later get such literary scrutiny. All footnotes not credited in the text are by James Boswell, the author of Life. Okay, so remember that, Kurt. All footnotes not credited in the text are by James Boswell. Notes signed James Boswell are by his second son, James Boswell Jr. Okay. Chief among the other identified annotators are Edmund Malone, Dr. Charles Burney, Alexander Chamblers, Reverend Dr. Kearney. He's a reverend and a doctor. James Dodsley, John Courtney, Reverend J.B. Blakesway, Thomas Wharton, John Nicol, and James Beattie. The publisher and the editor are greatly indebted to the librarian of the Harvard College, the library, for permission to print the marginalia from the Harvard copy of the Life, and to Donald and Mary Hyde for the use of their copy. I am under a special obligation in my introduction to the preliminary materials in the various volumes of the Boswell Papers, edited by Frederick A. Podel and others. The front-piece portraits of Dr. Johnson and Mrs. Piozzi in volumes 1 and 3, respectively, are in the possession of Courage, Barclay, and Simons, Limited, London, and are reproduced with their kind permission. The portrait of James Boswell in Volume 2 is reproduced through the courtesy of the National Galleries of Scotland, Edinburgh, EGF. So we've completed the notes on the text. So the things that I took away from that is that there was a long, what is that word? Provendas, or whatever it is, of the notes that apparently there were more than one copy of the Life that Mrs. Piozzi annotated. And this is a description of how those came to them. The notes came from various different versions, and there's a way to indicate that, which I don't care too much about that. That'd be more for the scholars. But any note that isn't cited is James Boswell's himself, and if it does say James Boswell, it's James Boswell's son that did it. Okay. Hey, I think we're ready to dive into this book improper. Yay, finally. So it took us a little while. It took 1, 2, 3. Was that 33? 33 pages. 33 pages in, and we still haven't started. So here we go. The Life of Samuel Johnson, LLD. I love the way they did this in these old books, right? It's like, I'm going to try to read it like I would imagine it would, right? So imagine you're a reader when this came out. When was it published? It says right there, but I can't read that. I don't remember. Well, it must have been shortly after. It was a few years after Johnson's death. Anyway, I'm going to try to read it like I'm a reader at the time. The Life of Samuel Johnson, LLD, comprehending an account of his studies and numerous works in chronological order. A series of his epistolary correspondence and conversation with many eminent persons, and various original pieces of his composition never before published, the whole exhibiting a view of literature and literary men in Great Britain for nearly half a century, during which he flourished, in 2 volumes, by James Boswell, Esquire. And then there's some Latin here. They're probably not going to translate the Latin. I'm screwed. Something by Horatio, I think, or Horat. Volume the first, London, printed by Henry Baldwin for Charles Dilly in the Poultry. Charles Dilly in the Poultry. And then here's the date, MDCCXCI, whatever date that is. So in this book, then, we're going to have an account of his studies and numerous works in chronological order. So his work, a study, an account of these works, not the works themselves, an account of these works in chronological order, and then epistolary correspondence. Doesn't that mean like letters? An epistle is a letter, right? So letters and conversations with many eminent persons. And various original pieces of his composition never before published, the stuff that somehow didn't make it into his other books. Covering about a half a century. Let's do it. Now we're going to begin the actual writing of Boswell, who I think is actually a very good writer. Dedication to Sir Joshua Reynolds. My dear sir, every liberal motive that can off to a stumbling start. My dear sir, every liberal motive that can actuate an author in the dedication of his labors concurs in directing me to you as the person to whom the following work should be inscribed. If there be a pleasure in celebrating the distinguished merit of a contemporary, mixed with a certain degree of vanity not altogether inexhaustible, in appearing fully sensible of it, where can I find one, in complimenting whom I can with more general approbation gratify those feelings? Your excellence, not only in the art over which you have long presided with unrivaling fame, but also in philosophy and elegant literature, is well known to the present, and will continue to be the admiration of future ages. Your equal and placid temper, your variety of conversation, your true politeness, by which you are so amiable in private society, and that enlarged hospitality which has long made your house a common center of union for the great, the accomplished, the learned, and the ingenious. All these qualities I can, in perfect confidence of not being accused of flattery, ascribe to you. If a man may indulge an honest pride in having it known to the world that he has been thought worthy of particular attention by a person of the first eminence in the age in which he lived, whose company has been universally courted, I am justified in availing myself of the usual privilege of a dedication, where I mention that there has been a long and uninterrupted friendship between us. If gratitude should be acknowledged for favors received, I have this opportunity, my dear sir, most sincerely to thank you for the many happy hours which I owe to your kindness, for the cordiality with which you have at all times been pleased to welcome me, for the number of valuable acquaintances to whom you have introduced me, for the, here comes a little Latin, noctis conequi dium, which I have enjoyed under your roof. So we're just going to have to go without understanding what the Latin is. So he's enjoyed some noctis quonique delirium dium under his roof. If a work should be inscribed to one who is master of the subject of it, and whose approbation, therefore, must ensure its credit and success, the life of Dr. Johnson is, with the greatest propriety, dedicated to Sir Joshua Reynolds, who was the intimate and beloved friend of the great man, the friend whom he declared to be the most invulnerable man he knew, whom, if he could quarrel with him, he should find the most difficulty how to abuse. You, my dear sir, studied him, and knew him well. You venerated and admired him. Yet, luminous as he was upon the whole, you perceived all the shades which mingled in the grand composition, all the little peculiarities and slight blemishes which marked the literary colossus. Your very warm commendation of the specimen which I gave in my journal of the tour to the Hebrides, of my being able to preserve his conversation in the authentic and lively manner which opinion the public has confirmed, was the best encouragement for me to persevere in my purpose of producing the whole of my stores. In one respect, this work will, in some passages, be different from the former. In my tour, I was almost unboundedly open in my communications, and from my eagerness to display the wonderful fertility and readiness of Johnson's wit, freely showed to the world its dexterity, even when I was myself the object of it. I trusted that I should be liberally understood, as knowing very well what I was about, and by no means as simply unconscious of the pointed effects of the satire. Wow. I own in would, but wow, what a man. I remember that. I remember that when I was reading the tour and how Johnson would have that pointed wit sometimes aimed at Boswell, and how he just took it. Now I know why. I own, indeed, that I was arrogant enough to suppose that the tenure of the rest of the book would sufficiently guard me against such a strange imputation. But it seems I judged too well of the world. For though I could scarcely believe it, I have been undoubtedly informed that many persons, especially in distant quarters, not penetrating enough into Johnson's character so as to understand his mode of treating his friends, have arraigned my judgment, instead of seeing that I was sensible of all that they could observe. Yeah, I'm one of them. I'm guilty of that. And until now, just hearing the man describe it himself, I didn't realize that. I'm really glad that I read the tour of from the Hebrides before I read this, because that wouldn't have made sense to me otherwise. There's a snowman on my beer. It is related of the great Dr. Clarke that when, in one of his leisure hours, he was unbending himself with a few friends in the most playful and frolicsome manner, he observed Beau Nash approaching, upon which he suddenly stopped. "My boys," said he, "let us be grave. Here comes a fool." The world, my friend, I have found to be a great fool, as to that particular on which it has become necessary to speak very plainly. I have, therefore, in this work been more reserved, and though I tell nothing but the truth, I have still kept in my mind that the whole truth is not always to be exposed. Principle of wisdom, principle of maturity right there. This, however, I have managed so as to occasion no diminution of the pleasure which my book should afford, though malignity may sometimes be disappointed by its gratifications. I am, my dear sir, your most obliged friend and faithful, humble servant, James Boswell. London, April 20th, 1791. So that's the dedication, indeed, to a man apparently quite worthy, Sir Joshua Reynolds. Okay, next bit. Advertisement to the first edition. I at last deliver to the world a work which I have long promised, and of which, I am afraid, too high expectations have been raised. The delay of its publication must be imputed, in a considerable degree, to the extraordinary zeal which has been shown by distinguished persons in all quarters to supply me with additional information concerning its illustrious subject, resembling in this the grateful tribes of ancient nations, of which every individual was eager to throw a stone upon the grave of a departed hero, and thus to share in the pious office of erecting an honorable monument to his memory. The labor and anxious attention with which I have collected and arranged the material of which these volumes are composed will hardly be conceived by those who read them with careless faculty. The stretch of mind and prompt assiduity by which so many conversations were preserved, I myself at some distance of time contemplate with wonder. And I must be allowed to suggest that the nature of the work, in other respects as it consists of innumerable detached particulars, all which, even the most minute, I have spared no pains to ascertain with a scrupulous authenticity, has occasioned a degree of trouble far beyond that of any other species of composition. Were I to detail the books which I have consulted, and the inquiries which I have found it necessary to make by various channels, I should probably be thought ridiculously ostentatious. Let me only observe, as a specimen of my trouble, that I have sometimes been obliged to run half over London in order to fix a date correctly, which, when I had accomplished, I well knew would obtain me no praise, though a failure would have been to my discredit. And after all, perhaps, hard as it may be, I shall not be surprised if omissions or mistakes be pointed out with invidious severity. I have also been extremely careful as to the exactness of my quotations, holding that there is a respect due to the public which should oblige every author to attend to this, and never to presume to introduce them with, "I think I have read," or "if I remember right," when the originals may be examined. There's a beep, beep, beep going on. I don't know if it's coming through. Someone's car alarm went off. We'll just wait a second for that to pass. There we go. I beg leave to express my warmest thanks to those who have been pleased to favor me with communications and advice in the conduct of my work. But I cannot sufficiently acknowledge my obligations to my friend Mr. Malone, who was so good as to allow me to read to him almost the whole of my manuscript, and make such remarks as were greatly for the advantage of the work. Excuse me. Pardon me. Though it is but fair to him to mention that upon many occasions I differed from him and followed my own judgment. I regret exceedingly that I was deprived of the benefit of his revision, when not more than one half of the book had passed through the press. But after having completed his very laborious and admirable edition of Shakespeare, for which he generously would accept of no other reward than that fame which he has so deservedly obtained, he fulfilled his promise of a long wished-for visit to his relations in Ireland, from which his safe return, Finibus Atticus, is desired by his friends here, with all the classical ardor of secte diva potest sepri. For there is no man in whom more elegant and worthy qualities were united, and whose society, therefore, is more valued by those who know him. It's interesting that clearly the people that this was written for were a class of people who could understand Latin. It is painful for me to think that while I was carrying on this work, several of those to whom it would have been most interesting have died. Such melancholy disappointments we know to be incidental to humanity, but just the thought that I was thinking the same thing. Incidental to the mass of humanity, including those who died. Although it's nothing to them anymore. but we do not feel them as the less. It's so interesting how a thought from 250 years ago can come reverberate right up, and I mean the same sentiment before he even said it. Let me particularly lament the Reverend Thomas Wharton and the Reverend Dr. Adams, Mr. Wharton, and the Reverend Dr. Adams. Mr. Wharton, amidst his variety of genius and learning, was an excellent biographer. His contributions to my collection are highly estimable, and as he had a true relish of my tour to the Hebrides, I trust I should now have been grateful with a larger share of his kind approbation. Dr. Adams, eminent as the head of a college, as a writer, and as a most amiable man, had known Johnson from his early years, and was his friend through life. What reason I had to hope for the countenance of that venerable gentleman to this work will appear from what he wrote to me upon a former occasion from Oxford, November 17th, 1785. Dear Sir, I hazard this letter, not knowing where it will find you, to thank you for your very agreeable tour, which I found here on my return from the country, and in which you have depicted our friend so perfectly to my fancy, in every attitude, every scene and situation, that I have thought myself in the company and of the party almost throughout. It has given very general satisfaction, and those who have found most fault with a passage here and there have agreed that it could not help going through. And being entertained with the whole, I wish indeed some few gross expressions had been softened, and a few of our hero's foibles had been a little more shaded. But it is useful to see the weakness incident to great minds, and you have given us Dr. Johnson's authority that in history all ought to be told. Damn! Damn! Such a sanction to my faculty of giving a just representation of Dr. Johnson I could not conceal. No. Nor will I suppress my satisfaction in the consciousness that by recording so considerable a portion of the wisdom and wit of the brightest ornament of the 18th century, I have largely provided for the instruction and entertainment of mankind. Yes, you have. That's the end of it. So that's London, April 20th, 1791. Wow, that was good. Shall we carry on? Why not? Advertisement to the second edition. So I guess there was a first edition of the book and a second edition, and he put like a little advertisement thingy in there. Let's see. That I was anxious for the success of a work which had employed much of my time and labor, I do not wish to conceal. But whatever doubts I at that time entertained have been entirely removed by the very favorable reception with which it has been honored. That reception has been excited by my best exertions to render my book more perfect, and in this endeavor I have had the assistance not only of some of my particular friends, but of many other learned and ingenious men, by which I have been enabled to rectify some mistakes, and to enrich the work with many valuable additions. These I have ordered to be printed separately in quarto, for the accommodation of the purchasers of the first edition. May I be permitted to say that the typography of both editions does honor to the press of Mr. Henry Baldwin, now master of the worshipful Company of Stationers, whom I have long known as a worthy man and an obliging friend. Well, I better stop. The dogs want to get fed. So what time is it? Gosh only knows. I'm going to get a clock and put it on that wall. So we'll stop there for tonight. Yeah, when I start tomorrow, I'll reread that part again, the advertisement of the second edition. Put this right here. And I've got this book I want to read too. My friend Juan suggested it to me, a science fiction book, Necromancer, by William Gibson. So I've got it sitting up there. I've been meaning to get started on that, but haven't done it yet. You're ready to get fed, huh? Come on. Come here. You want to jump up? Come on. Let's see. All right, Lydia says VOYVFYI. What does that mean? I don't know. Okay, take care. I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.